please. Before we get started, I do want to just make a couple of housekeeping. I'm sure some of you have probably wondered, ladies and men's rooms, double doors to my left, ladies' room, double doors to the right, men's room. So if you need those, feel free to use them. We also have snacks and water in the back of the room on both sides if you guys determine that you need that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask our registration staff to keep 2 people at the door. The other staff can come ahead and go ahead and come on in. Good morning. We can do much better than that. Good morning. Well, thank you, because I'm so excited to see all of you guys here today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Kimberly Wise. I am the Indiana Field Office Director for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development with our offices here in Indianapolis. Before I get too far along, we want to get a good idea of the folks that we have here with us today. So if you could, if you are currently a non-PHA landlord, so you don't have a voucher resident and you're here, can you please raise your hand? Thank you. Representatives of public housing authorities. And I need for you guys to raise yours high. Make sure you look around. Make sure you know who you have at your table. Make sure you know who you need to mingle with. Do we have any industry groups? Landlords, whoa. Raise them, hi, we want to see you. Good job, thank you. Do we have any elected officials? And how many folks are not in any of those groups? What group would you be representing? Thank you. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Thank you. Well, thank you guys for being here very much. We really do appreciate that. But of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the people who actually helped us put this on today. So if we could, the Indianapolis HUD Field Office staff, can you please raise your hand? If you're doing business in Indiana and you're happen to be working with the voucher program, this is the staff that you will be working with in our office. So I really want to thank them. It's because of them that we were able to do the work that we're doing here today. However, this is a huge undertaking and it takes an entire team. So I also want to thank all of our HUD staff from other offices and headquarters who are here with us today to make sure that we're able to record this, but to make sure that we also make sure this went off without a hitch. So could you guys please stand? So on behalf of HUD, and particularly the Indianapolis Field Office, I'd like to welcome you to the HUD's Indianapolis Housing Choice Voucher Landlord Symposium. The goals of this symposium are to provide opportunity for landlords, housing authorities, and HUD to connect, to share information about the Housing Choice Voucher Program, any changes, upcoming changes, or ideas that you may have. It's also, most importantly, to increase landlord participation in the program. The Housing Choice Voucher Program is the nation's largest rental subsidy program and currently assists more than 2 million low-income and very low-income households each year in the private rental market. The HCV program is dependent on owner participation. HUD has been concerned that the tightening rental markets is becoming increasingly difficult for voucher families to find affordable housing. And we felt that particularly here across the state of Indiana. We also want to know what's not working. We're here to hear from you guys today. This will be interactive. There's a number of opportunities for you guys to ask questions. We ask you to take this opportunity to be sure and do that. We have representatives here from the highest level of public housing, and they're here to listen to and answer any questions that you guys have. So the Secretary established the department-wide landlord task force to examine how we can make changes and how we can increase landlord participation and property managers. The goal of this task force is to hear directly from those we rely upon to make the Housing Choice Voucher Program work. This symposium is intended to reveal how HUD might make our voucher program more accessible and acceptable, specifically in higher opportunity neighborhoods where landlord participation is at its all-time lowest. What we hear today will help to guide us as we look to make whatever changes we can under our authority to improve the likelihood that landlords say yes to tenants with housing choice vouchers. We hope you will participate and enjoy this important discussion. It cannot happen without you. And now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. At this time, I want to introduce Hunter Kurtz. Mr. Kurtz. So Mr. Kurtz was confirmed in June of 2019 as the Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing. With more than a decade of federal service, Hunter's most recently served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing. He has also served in the White House as a Deputy Chief of Staff at the Council of Economic Advisors. In addition to his federal service, Hunter also served as the Deputy Director of Detroit's Department of Housing and Revitalization. He is a Pennsylvania native who holds a Bachelor of Arts from Hamilton College and a professional certification in housing development and finance. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Hunter Kurtz. And before I let Hunter go, if you have any questions, there will be a roaming mic going around. Leah will have that mic. Mr. Hunter is going to provide an opportunity for questions. So if you could just raise your hand if you have a question. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you all for inviting me here to speak. And thank you for attending our inaugural Landlord Symposium hosted by HUD. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Hunter Kurtz. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing. As mentioned, I've spent most of my professional career working in the housing industry. I consider myself a houser at heart, a practitioner of HUD programs, and a true believer in the department's mission. I've spent most of my professional career in a variety of positions at HUD, both serving the Bush administration as an appointee, as well as coming back as a career civil servant during the Obama administration. And as mentioned additionally, I was the Deputy Director of the City of Detroit's Department of Housing and Revitalization. And there I dealt with a lot of the issues we'll be talking about today at this symposium. But I can confidently say that being the Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing is the best job I've ever had. I get to wake up every morning and know that the programs that I work with are assisting 3.6 million families across the country and providing them with safe, decent, and affordable housing. But I don't do this alone. I have a great staff at PIH that I work with, and they all work with you, our various stakeholders, to ensure that families have the supportive services they need and that we are effectively carrying out our program's missions, including one of these programs is the largest rental subsidy program in the country, known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or HCV, what we're here to talk about today. As you know, HCV allows the federal government to assist low-income families, the elderly, and the disabled to find their own housing in a private market. The HCV program helps over 2 million families that live in affordable housing across the country. Since the formation of the Landlord Task Force, we've gone around the country engaging landlords like you to learn what your concerns are and how we can improve the HCV program. I truly believe that housing choice vouchers are the best way to give families this choice to determine where they want to live. But the choice is limited without the trust and support of good landlords. We have an exciting agenda for you today. There'll be presenters from the state as well as the local level, as well as HUD subject matter experts that are looking forward to answering any questions you may have. At this symposium, you will hear about the critical role that landlords play, along with new initiatives we're implementing to make the programs more effective. The most critical component to make this program work is landlord participation. And I know I keep saying that, but it really is key. Without your help, PHA waitlists would never be open, and low-income households across Indiana and the country would not be able to make ends meet. Right now, there are already over 37,000 HCV units in Indiana and 13,000 right here in Indianapolis. As you know, there are many reasons to accept an HCV. Once the tenant has moved in, you have a guaranteed revenue source from the federal government. This rent will always come every month, even during the government shutdowns, thank you to provisions in the housing assistance payment contracts. This reduces both the costs associated with late rents and the likelihood of an eviction. HCVs are in high demand, meaning units occupied by voucher holders generally have a shorter vacancy window, and a unit produces rental income from a voucher holder for a longer period of time than if the unit was rented by a non-voucher holder or on the private market. Because of this lower turnaround for HCV units than non-Section 8 units, this saves costs on marketing and screening for new tenants. You may have also heard that we're improving our inspection process, and I know this is something we're going to talk about later today, but we have this new initiative called Inspire. We have an overall goal of just improving and modernizing the physical inspections that we're doing across the country. To prepare for this, our team has traveled around the country and hosted listening sessions on our inspections. And we've heard from you and your colleagues about how the inspection process could be updated for the betterment of stakeholders. We've heard from you, and in August, we published the Inspire demonstration notice. This demonstration will include approximately 4,500 multifamily and public housing units that will be implemented on a rolling wide nation basis. In the near future, HUD will use Inspire as the inspection standard for all of its programs, including the Housing Choice Voucher Program. We're hard at work at keeping our programs updated and modernized. So I'd like to mention several improvements and initiatives that are in the works. If you'd like to hear more details about these, we'll discuss them more throughout the day, or you could ask, I guess, some questions when we do that as well. For instance, we have published the new HCV guidebook. We decided the best way to get this information out would be, rather than publishing it on when it's complete, we've been putting out chapters as they've been finished. We hope to have the final document out in completion later in 2020. But we've also created a new web page at HUD.gov where landlords can find all the information they need, relevant documents and resources that are important. And finally, we've put together a new initiative through the Moving to Work program. And for those of you that don't know, Moving to Work is a series of innovative strategies where we give additional flexibility to public housing authorities across the country. We'll be expanding through 4 new rounds over the coming months, and one of those rounds will be focused on and studying landlord initiatives and incentives to see how we can encourage landlords' participation in the HCV program. So we're very excited about that and that rollout here in the near future. But these are just a few highlights of the incredible work that's going into the HCV program. But in general, I believe that creating opportunities in our communities can never be the job of just one sector. All of us, whether it's in the public, private, or nonprofit space, must come together and work as a well-coordinated team. So while we're here in Indianapolis, take some time to reflect and celebrate your accomplishments. Re-energize yourselves and recommit to our shared goal of helping low-income families. And I also hope you take advantage of our HUD's team expertise that's here, especially the HCV staff. We're truly here to be your partners and in this work. So thank you for letting me speak. Thank you for the work you guys are doing every day. I know I like to say that this is the best job because I get to help 3.6 million families, but it really is you all out there every day that are actually the ones that get to work directly and assist with that process. So thank you for the work you do, and thank you for having me. And I guess I'm taking some questions now. So there's got to be some questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll make it up. No, I'm just kidding. Here, we got a question right here. Oh, they got a microphone for you. That's why I was waiting. I'm sorry.
my name is Lakeisha. We have properties in both Fort Wayne as well as the Indianapolis market, and we see a huge disparity in terms of the inspection process. For instance, if we have a current participant that is occupying the resident, if there's a new prospective tenant in Indianapolis, the original tenant is required to move out, and the property should be unoccupied in order for an initial inspection to be performed on a prospective tenant. However, in Fort Wayne, there is some grace that is allowed, and a current tenant that occupies a property does not make it difficult to conduct an inspection for a new prospective tenant. So I'd like to sort of get your take on that and how that can be more standardized to assist landlords and to reduce what you consider the vacancy window.
So the inspection process is for the housing choice vouchers is done by the local public housing authority, but we're going to be setting the standards through this new Inspire model, and this is the type of thing, we've been using the same model, various models of inspections for years, and Congress has asked us to sort of standardize and create one. So these are the type of things that this input, really rather than saying I have a comment on that, I'd say I'd really like to take that back, and our Dan in the back there, who's going to be speaking about Inspire later, and let him keep that as we continue to take input back on how this is working and see how we can improve it in the future. Oh, I got another question over here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have two questions.
Sure.
So the mobility NOFA, when do you expect that to be released? It was supposed to be released, I thought, in the spring, late this year. So do you have any idea?
Very soon, correct? Early spring. Early spring, yes. Allison always tells me that, and then I forget. This is like the second event I've been with her where she told me that, and then I blanked. So we are.
And then my second question is, what do you think the admin fees are going to look like for the upcoming year?
I can't answer that question because I just don't know. I said I'd make up answers, but I'm not. Go ahead.
So 100%?
We'll see. We'll see when we get more guidance on the budget. So.
There will be extra money through this mobility NOFA to help with landlord recruitment, or is it strictly going to be tenant-driven?
Yes, I think I'm going to let Allison, who's our mobility expert.
Hi, so for those of you who aren't familiar, Congress funded a housing choice voucher mobility demonstration with $25 million in the 2019 budget. So that was finalized in February or March of this year. And we've been working to draft. It's a competitive process where housing authorities apply for this money to help tenants access areas of opportunity. And so as we're crafting it, it is both about helping families understand the wide range of housing options throughout a region, but also recruiting landlords, what sort of incentives might be useful to encourage landlords to participate, so it should be both. So we expect that housing authorities will be able to apply for that in the early spring of 2020. It's pretty exciting.
Any other questions? That's all? All right. Well, thank you very much for letting me come speak, and I believe I am supposed to welcome our next speaker, the Deputy Mayor of the city here for Community Development, Jeff Bennett. Thank you all.
All right, let's make sure I understand how the clicker works. I clearly don't. There we go. All right. So thank you, Hunter, for being here and for your remarks, and thank you to the HUD Indianapolis field office for bringing us all together today. I've known Kimberly for a long time, and I know that that's the phone call that you step out of a meeting to take. And when she asks you to participate, you say, what time should I be there? So I am grateful for the opportunity to talk about, well, first of all, let me welcome you all to Indianapolis. Those of you who aren't from here, my job as deputy mayor is to greet people many times. So thank you for your work in this field, and thank you for being here today. I have the sort of double task now of talking about our work using housing choice vouchers and our work in affordable housing generally here in the city of Indianapolis. And it's something that is close to my heart because I've worked either in city government on issues like affordable housing and homelessness and community economic development, or on the nonprofit side of community development for the last 20 years. And I know that the difficulty that we have across the state and certainly across the country in developing affordable housing, especially deeply affordable housing for very low-income residents. Kimberly did some audience participation. I'd like to ask just one question, or two questions, I guess. Who is not from Indianapolis or does not do work in Indianapolis, by a show of hands? Okay, and then who is from Indianapolis and or does work in Indianapolis? Okay, so this will be, for those of you who aren't from here, a little bit of a case study on what we've done over the last 4 years. For those of you that are from here, I hope it is a recruitment tool if you're a property owner or developer to get you to participate in the work that we're doing here. This is a talk that I give quite a bit about our community plan to end homelessness. I'm not going to go through it all, but I think you'll get the entire slide deck at a later time. I'm just going to highlight a few slides. I want to reiterate that we fully understand that affordable housing is difficult to develop. It's expensive to build new. We need more participation in this space. The housing choice voucher is a double benefit. It's a benefit certainly to our very low-income residents who need access to housing and a means to pay for it. And it's a benefit to the landlords because it is a source of income that can help make a development pencil out and help make a development operate once it's built or rehabbed. Later, I think throughout the day, you're going to hear some more maybe technical discussions. I think Bruce Nesra may be following me to talk about the Housing Choice Voucher Program in a little more depth, and you're going to hear some success stories later in the day. But I want to talk to you now for a little bit about Indianapolis's case and hopefully our work today to increase landlord participation in this work. So when we talk about our community plan to end homelessness, that is a 5-year plan. We are ending year 1 of that 5-year plan at the end of December. We have multiple partners, so I like to say that this isn't a city plan, it's a community plan, and there are lots of community partners. We have the State Housing Community Development Authority, the Coalition for Homelessness Intervention and Prevention, which is CHIP by abbreviation, the Indianapolis Continuum of Care, and many of you who work in the public housing space and on these issues understand what a local continuum of care is and what they do. Those of you who do not, I'd be glad to chat with you offline because I'm on a limited time to describe what a continuum of care does. And then perhaps most vitally on this slide is the participation of our local public housing authority, the Indianapolis Housing Agency. Come on. There we go. So let's skip ahead, if I can. I don't know where to point. Oh, okay. I'm pointing it at the projector for some reason. All right, keep going. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Stop there. Okay, so community plan is a robust plan. It's got 3 main strategies. One is to engage people where they are, whether that's in need of housing because they are unhoused, unsheltered, or whether they're in the shelter system, or whether they're in housing that ain't great. The second plan strategy, the main plan strategy, is to increase the availability of and access to affordable housing. Okay, and a means of rental assistance to pay for it. So go to the next slide. We fundamentally believe in Indianapolis that housing is a human right, and that access to housing immediately, as quickly as possible, is the best way to stabilize a vulnerable person and to reduce the strain and sort of burden on the system, quote unquote, the system. It's less expensive to house people quickly and to keep them housed permanently than it is to sort of force them through a multi-step process that involves encampment and shelter and 12-step programs. Let's get people housed as quickly as possible. And what ends up happening is the cost to all of us goes down. The cost to us as taxpayers, the cost to us as landlords, the cost to us as practitioners goes down when we get people housed and keep them housed. And housing needs to be low barrier, and I'll get into how we can help you as landlords and developers make housing low barrier. Go to the next slide if you don't mind. So we need three things. We need housing units. We need a way to pay for those housing units. And those housing units are usually apartments, but in some cases, in working with our PHA, they're single-family houses. So we need units, we need a way to pay for them, and for the purposes of today's discussion, the way to pay for them is using the Housing Choice Voucher, and we need supportive services. So it's one thing to house a vulnerable person and to be able to pay their rent. What we don't want to do is set that person up to fail by having them sort of be evicted within 90 days because they don't know how to maintain their housing, and that's a burden on the landlord too. So we need a robust system of high-quality support services to keep people housed. Next slide, sorry, next slide. So we engaged our housing authority, Indianapolis Housing Agency, to embark on this sort of experiment with us in 2017. We asked them if they would begin to provide a certain number of vouchers per month specifically dedicated to our most vulnerable residents, so folks who have been chronically homeless for the longest period of time. And God bless them, IHA said yes. So beginning in November of 2017, we started getting 9 tenant-based vouchers a month that we are deploying in partnership with our continuum of care to house the most vulnerable people in Indianapolis. And that may seem counterintuitive. Why would you start with the most vulnerable people? And it's frankly because they were the ones who had been left behind the longest and the ones where we thought we could maybe make the most noticeable impact. Right now, we are working with IHA between now and the end of the year to issue a sort of surge of 300 vouchers that they have capacity to issue. And we are going straight down our list, our coordinated entry system list of the most vulnerable people in Indianapolis and trying to get them housed. Next slide, please. That's hard to read. Let's keep going. Keep going. Let's stop there. As I said, it's one thing to just get folks housed and get their rent paid. We don't have the support service capacity locally that we need, and we recognize that at the outset of the mayor's administration in 2016. Like, we can't keep relying on small nonprofits that sort of struggle to make ends meet on their own and flood them with the most vulnerable residents in the city and not properly resource them and expect them to be able to keep them housed. What we were seeing, frankly, at that time was that caseloads that should be sort of 15 to 1 for our service providers were like 75 to 1. And I mean, that's not even case management at that ratio. So at the same time we were kind of figuring out how to house people quickly, we were also trying to figure out how do we either increase capacity within our service provider system or kind of rebuild the service provider system, almost like building the plane while we're flying the plane with the service provider system. So, next slide. So, our Central Indiana Community Foundation stepped up, kind of recognized the work that we were doing, and earlier in, Rodney, was it 2018 or 2019? So earlier this year, like the time just is a blur. Early 2019, the Central Indiana Community Foundation said, okay, we recognize the need for support services funding, and we will commit to raising, when they announced it, $4 million to help us with a systems change effort for support services. That's increased to over $5 million that they've now agreed to raise, and they're about halfway there in just a few months' time. So we have the three pieces. We have units. We need more, so that's my ask of you today. We have vouchers, and I guess my ask would be of the federal government to think about how do we increase the voucher capacity across the country, because I think we all need more. And then we have a means to pay for services. Let's see, maybe next slide, or yeah. So what has happened since November 2017? Every single person we have housed, except for 2, remain housed. And the 2 were not evicted. So we have 0 evictions in operating a kind of local model of what the HUD Continuum of Care has sought to do through the federal model by housing people fast and permanently and surrounding them with services to keep them housed. What has happened from 2018's point-in-time count to 2019's point-in-time count for the city of Indianapolis is chronic homelessness, as measured on that one day a year, dropped 37%. The fact of the matter is we can house the most vulnerable people in our community, and we can keep them housed, as we've demonstrated in the last 24 months. And now we just need to get better and faster at it. The other thing that we've done that I think bears mentioning is, so to get landlords engaged who haven't worked in this space can be difficult because it's not easy to provide housing to very low-income residents. So what we created in partnership with CHIP, our local homelessness intervention and prevention sort of quarterbacking agency, we set aside some of our local housing trust funds to create a landlord loss mitigation fund. So if we can get a landlord interested in at least talking to us about this program, we can make it as easy as possible to take that vulnerable person and house them, because if there's damage caused by a tenant, we have a fund set aside to help pay for repairs of that damage. And what we would like to do, and what I think the direction we will go early next year, is also using that fund as an eviction prevention fund. So if there is an unforeseen circumstance and a cost that needs to be paid, and the difference between that cost being paid or not paid is the difference between staying housed and maybe someone being evicted, we can deploy those funds for eviction prevention in addition to loss mitigation. So that's where we are, and that's where we're going. I want to introduce a couple of people who are here that are, well, 3 people who are here. Shantae Taylor, first of all, from Indianapolis Housing Agency, who's our great partner on the, sort of the front lines of this from the IHA perspective. Amanda Wilkerson, who's sitting in the back. Amanda is working on landlord engagement specifically for deployment of the 300 vouchers that we have to issue in the next, 27 days? And sort of longer term landlord engagement, because this is an ongoing partnership. It doesn't, we never end homelessness, but we create a system where people are, people's lives are uprooted for the least possible period of time between crisis and rehousing. That's Amanda's gig, and she's good at it, and I hope that those of you here that may have some interest in working on this will talk to her. And then Rodney Stockman, who is the Senior Strategy Director for Homelessness out of the Mayor's Office. It's been Rodney's leadership, both at the state level over the course of his career and now at the local level, that has helped us really implement a system change model where we are no longer just sort of triaging and putting Band-Aids on crises, but we've really started to turn the corner on broad cooperation across lots of groups, and there's lots of passion and interest and expertise in this space, as you all know. And Rodney has been the one to, in some ways, herd the cats, but in other ways to get people working from the same script. And that's vitally important in an industry where we are dealing with vulnerable people by the hundreds and by the thousands over the course of a year. So I am grateful to have their partnership and their leadership and to be able to talk to you a little bit today about what we're doing in Indianapolis. And if I have time, and I may have 5 minutes or so left on my time, do you want me to take questions, Kimberly, or I would be glad to take questions.
Hi, I'm interested in the Landlord Mitigation Fund. If you could talk a little bit more about details for that, like eligibility requirements and like guidelines, and then also if that's paired with any tenant education.
So what I could, probably the best way to answer that would be to connect you sort of after the fact with Chip, who administers that fund. So what we did, and I had a hand in kind of drafting the initial outline of what that program might look like, but we ended up borrowing liberally from other cities. So what we were trying to do was look at the most likely amount of damage that might be caused by a resident and allow for a landlord to essentially make a claim for that amount up to above what the security deposit would pay. So if it was security deposit $500, damage was $2,000, they could make a claim for the $1,500. What I don't know is if Chip ended up incorporating the tenant education piece. What we have tried to do with our, and what I also don't know is whether that the presence of that fund has prevented evictions, because like I said, we've only had sort of 2 people leave the program that we created at the end of 2017, and they left for non-evictions. So my sense is maybe we are preventing some evictions through the presence of that fund. We're kind of doing a look back at the deployment of those funds. So if your contact information is available, I'd be glad to connect you directly to the folks who are administering the program. Rodney, do you have it? Perfect.
I don't think any city doesn't deal with a severe homelessness population as a percentage. So I quickly looked up what the population of Indianapolis was. We're in southern Indiana on the border with Louisville, Kentucky, so I know that's a different group. But it sounds like your percentages are 99% retention. So I was curious, when you say these people have been essentially on the streets the longest, do you have some, like, how many people have you housed? You said you've only lost 2. It wasn't due to eviction. Who are these people, I guess, kind of in a general term, and how many have you housed?
So we have housed through this program between 250 and 300, specifically related to the 9 set-aside vouchers per month. And now we're surging to try to add 300 more to that housing mix in the shortest period of time possible. When we started out, it was really an exercise in what does our system look like, and Rodney led us through, and Rodney and some outside consultants led us through kind of a mapping of how long does it take to get someone housed from the time we encounter them, they sort of get through the system, how long does it take to get units inspected, how long does it take to get leases signed and vouchers issued and all that. And so it was a test case to see can we squeeze that timeline and get it as short as possible, and we're still working on that. at the same time we were deploying these vouchers, we were about 5 months into a coordinated entry system for our local continuum of care. And for those of you that may not understand the sort of industry lexicon, what used to happen in Indianapolis is you could go to 5 different service providers, 10 different service providers, infinite number of service providers, and have an infinite number of ways to sort of access housing. And it was all done by lists that individuals kept and relationships that nonprofits had but didn't want to share with anybody else, and it's very territorial and very competitive. And we weren't making any traction in dealing with systemic issues of housing. The problem was getting worse. Our numbers were going up. HUD, to their credit, sort of forced the issue in Indianapolis and said, you have to adopt a coordinated entry system where there is one front door to housing, and that is a master list that's the same list that's kept by essentially everybody. And you can have multiple front doors, but you all access the same community list. And then, as people are engaged, vulnerable people are engaged, and they go into the coordinated entry sort of system, they are ranked for vulnerability. And there's a very sort of technical and industry standard way of tracking a person's vulnerability. And so we were able to know by name, and we still are today in real time, we were able to know by name who the most vulnerable person in Indianapolis is that's been engaged by our street outreach teams and service providers. That's really important, because now we know maybe the person who has been homeless the longest, they are unsheltered the longest, they have the most vulnerabilities, mental illness, addiction, criminal background, what have you, and we can tell who sort of needs housing the most based on that ranking list. So when we say we house between 250 and 300 people, we start with the most vulnerable person and kind of work our way down. We have seen a decrease in chronic homelessness, but our work hasn't been perfect. Our veterans number actually went up between 2018 and 2019. So we're identifying gaps in the system that we've built. It just so happens that we were building coordinated entry at about the same time vouchers were coming online, at about the same time we were developing our new 5-year plan that launched at the beginning of 2019, and the stars had kind of aligned for us to really jump in with both feet. And now we're spending time identifying gaps. There are definitely gaps in our coordinated entry system. We're getting really good at housing the most vulnerable people in the community, and we're really good at housing the least vulnerable people in our community, the ones who can just go right back into housing using ESG or rapid rehousing funds or not federal funds, whatever we have locally, housing trust funds. We have a gap in the middle of our coordinated entry system, people that aren't quite vulnerable enough to get housed quickly, and people who aren't quite self-sufficient enough to just go right back into housing. And that gap in the middle is what we're trying to figure out. I got to be respectful of time. So there's a question over here.
I understand it's HUD's policy to not lend assistance to convicted felons or drug-related charges.
Sorry. Recording.
Sorry, Mayor. I understand that HUD has strict regulations regarding who can get assistance. What I mean is violent offenders, drug abusers who have long history, not even long history, just a drug charge in the past 3 years. I believe they're disqualified from receiving HUD assistance. I just heard you say that you have people on the street that have drug addiction problems. How did HUD overcome that block?
Well, that is an ongoing conversation in our community, probably like it is in every community. We've had really great success working with IHA on the sort of list of offenses, and how do we make it as low barrier, as easy as possible to get people housed? And they've shown a willingness to work with us on those offenses. Now, there are some that are kind of non-starters, and we have to address the sort of the sex offender issue and meth and things like that. But I mean, by and large, we have been able to work with them on a case-by-case basis, identifying specific people and their barriers to housing and getting them housed.
Can I clarify? Can I clarify something real quickly? There are only two prohibitions in public housing for people to live in public housing from the federal level. Those are sex offenders and people who have manufactured meth.
Yeah.
And there's some, even that has a narrow definition of where you're manufacturing meth. So anything else is restrictions placed by the Public Housing Authority and not by us.
Yeah, and that's where our Public Housing Authority has shown a willingness to be really flexible as we kind of figure out what our system should look like locally.
Quick question, folks. So we have a little bit of time for a break after this. We can take a couple more questions, but then you're not going to get a very long break. Do we have a preference?
So everyone can embarrass themselves by walking to the restroom in the middle of talks. It's totally fine.
Should we do one more question? Okay.
Okay, so I am a landlord, and the child abuse offenders can't live within 2 blocks of schools, parks, and so forth. Where do we refer them to? Are there places in the city, outside the city? What are we doing with them? Because I have had a situation where we moved a guy in, and then when he went back to his probation officer, he was told he had to move. Well, that caused us a loss as well as him losing money as well. So is there any place in the city where these types of offenders can go?
So there is, but I guess I should clarify. It's like registered sex offenders can't be within 1,000 feet of schools and some other sort of public locations. But if there's a specific prohibition in a person's conviction, because child abuse shouldn't be something by itself that prohibits somebody from living 1,000 feet from a school. It would be a registered sex offender. So there are some resources in Indianapolis. I'm thinking Volunteers of America specifically that work with sex offenders and try to rehouse them. Now we have a massive shortage in that specific type of housing, but we do have nonprofits that work on that. So I would want to be sure why that person is prohibited from living in that unit that you had provided. If it's a connection that needs to be made to VOA, like we can provide you with that information. But if it's something else, we should be able to work through it, because I think as Hunter clarified and as IHA has shown a willingness to do, if it's a voucher holder that is qualified to have that voucher, they should be able to live in your unit. I'm sorry. Well, thank you. And please meet Amanda and meet Rodney while you're here today and get plugged into our system. We'd love to have you participate. Thank you. I could take about 15 minutes.
All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Leah Anderson. I'm one of the co-leads on the Landlord Task Force. So thanks for being here. We're really, really glad that you're here. A couple more housekeeping things. So in your folders on the left side, there's a piece of paper for you to take notes if you really want to. There's another piece of paper that says comments. That's if there's something you want HUD to know that you don't want to or don't have an opportunity to say out loud. There's a line for you to put your email. You don't have to put your email. That's if you want us to follow up with you. So it can be totally anonymous, and you'll just leave those on your tables at the end of lunch or at the end of the morning session or the end of the afternoon session. Another housekeeping thing, I was in here almost all day yesterday, and while it is a beautiful room, the sun can be rather brutal. So please feel free to wear your sunglasses, move your chair around. We want you guys to be comfortable. So don't worry about moving. Everybody's probably going to do it in the afternoon. These folks are going to get the sun. Last housekeeping thing, I am going to send the slides out maybe at lunch. We don't have Wi-Fi, and it's a big file, so I don't know if it'll send. But if it won't send at lunch, I will send it at the end of the day. So no need to take pictures of the slides unless you really want to. And you might not need to take notes. That's up to you. But there is a page for you to take notes, and you will get the slides. So with that, everybody go ahead and stand up. I teach yoga on Fridays. We're not going to do anything intense, but I want to keep you awake and feeling good. So just kind of.
Hello, hello, hello. Can you please take your seats? We're ready to start. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. All right, we're about to start. My name is Bruce Nesrum. I'm the Public Housing Director for the Indianapolis Field Office. I just got the job 6 months ago, but I've been at the Housing Authority. I've been at the Indianapolis Indianapolis Field Office for over 20 years, and I've worked with most of you that worked at the housing authorities. One way or the other, and the others will get to know you today. What we're going to go through today is the HCV basics. And those are the basics of what you need to know if you're going to be a landlord on this program. But before I start doing that, I want to ask a question. Who knows what a repositioning is? Raise your hand if you know what a repositioning is. Okay, so HUD has come up with a new concept called repositioning. And repositioning means that we're going to take public housing authorities and reposition them into voucher programs. Last year, the field office had a target of 993 units to reposition, and we accomplished that goal by repositioning over 1,200 units. And this year, our goal is to reposition 735 units. And what does that mean? That means once we do the repositioning, guess what happens? Those clients that live in those units will get a voucher. And if they get a voucher, they will need a landlord to rent them the unit. And that's why this symposium is very, very important, that we attract more landlords to the program. Another good example is in Gary, Indiana, we repositioned 351 units. And all those 351 candidates that live in those units received a voucher. And there's no housing, 351 unit housing, affordable housing in Gary for those people to move in. And that is one of the things that we're trying to do this symposium so that we could attract the landlords to rent those houses. And one of the things, before I start, one of the things that happen with this program is if you don't use it, you lose it. So if those vouchers are not used, what happens to them? The clients will lose those vouchers, and the housing authority will lose the funding from HUD moving forward. Okay? So it's very important that this program becomes a success by attracting more landlords to the program. Okay? So I'm going to go through the basics of the Housing Choice Voucher. The Housing Choice Voucher program is the federal government's major program for assisting very low-income families, the elderly, and the disabled to afford decent, safe, sanitary housing in the private market. Okay? Since housing assistance is provided on behalf of the family or individual, participants are able to find their own housing, including single-family homes, townhomes, and apartments. So once you get the voucher, and any client that gets the voucher, the housing authority cannot steer the client to any landlord. His client is allowed to go on their own and find their own housing of choice, anywhere they want to live in. So once they find that housing, then they could come back to the housing authority to notify them where they have found the housing. The housing authority does not have the right to steer any client to any housing. The client is allowed to find their own housing. And that's what the next slide is saying. The participant is free to choose any housing that meets the requirement of the program and is not limited to units located in the subsidized housing projects. So as you can see, subsidized housing are being eliminated slowly. And once that is eliminated, there won't be much subsidized housing left. So the voucher program will allow the client to find private housing somewhere. And that's why this symposium is very important for the landlords to participate. And the voucher program is administered by the local housing authority. HUD does not administer any of the vouchers. We have a contract with the local housing authorities to administer the vouchers, and that's how the voucher program works. So once the family is issued a housing choice voucher, they are responsible to find a suitable housing of their choice and notify the housing authority. And then once they find the suitable housing, the subsidy is paid to the landlord by the housing authority through the HUD, providing the funding. Who's eligible for the HCV vouchers? The housing authority determines who is eligible for the housing choice voucher program. HUD does not do that. So when you come into the housing authority, for you to be able to apply for the housing choice voucher program, you have to first of all identify the housing authority in your jurisdiction. And once you identify that housing authority in your jurisdiction, you have to make sure that the waiting list is open, because you cannot just walk up to the housing authority and say, I need housing and I want to register. So that's, you have to make sure that the waiting list is open. So once the waiting list is open, then you are able to get your name on the waiting list. And the housing authority will determine if you qualify by looking at your annual gross income, the family size, and the voucher program is only allowed to be used by the U.S. citizens. But you could have, as a U.S. citizen, you could have a non-citizen living with you, and you are allowed to get a voucher. And that's what we call mixed family. In a mixed family, there's a way we calculate the income for a mixed family. So if you're a U.S. citizen and you get a voucher, you are allowed to have a mixed family, somebody else that is not a citizen of the United States to live with you. The family income may not exceed 50% of the median income for the county or metropolitan area that you live in. And that's how we determine your income. And by law, the HUD allows you to lease up, provide 75% of the vouchers to applicants whose income do not exceed 30%. That is required for the housing authorities. 75% on the voucher program must be less than 30% of the median income of the county or metropolitan area. During the application process, the PHA is required to gather the information from the family, the assets that they own, and the family composition, which is very, very critical here. Because with the family composition, we need to know every person that lives in that family, because the PHA vets everybody that lives there. They have to do a criminal background check of any before you get the vouchers. Like Mr. Hunter said earlier, you are allowed, even if you committed a crime, you are allowed to be on the program. But the program is based, every housing authority has what we call administrative plan. So before you come on the program, you need to ask the housing authority to look at the administrative plan and see what the eligibility for the administrative plan states, because every housing authority is allowed to do an administrative plan beyond and above HUD basic rules. Okay? And the PHA will verify this information with local agencies, your employer, the bank, and we use this information to determine program eligibility and the amount of the housing assistance payment. Usually some PHAs don't do this at the beginning. They'll do this after you get on the waiting list. And when they call you up on the waiting list, they will go through this process. So it depends on what PHA that you're dealing with. And that's how that works. And if the PHA determines that your family is eligible, the PHA will put your name on the waiting list. Well, some PHAs will do that, but some will just put your name on the waiting list and then determine when they call you up to get a voucher, your eligibility under the program. How the HCV works. The HCV places the choice of housing in the hands of the individual, which I've just stated before, and the housing authority cannot steer the client to any landlord. The low-income family is allowed to find their own housing of choice, and includes everything you could think of: motorhomes, module homes, stick-built homes, and so forth and so on. The housing unit selected by the family must meet an acceptable level of health and safety issues. That means before a client moves into that rental property, that they have found from the landlord, that unit must pass HQS inspection, housing quality standard inspection. That means the housing authority will come in there and inspect the units and make sure that the units pass housing quality standards before the housing authority will allow you to rent that unit. And once the housing authority passes once the unit passes the HQS inspection, the housing authority will determine what the payment standard is. So based on your family composition, the housing authority would assign you the voucher numbers, how many vouchers that you're entitled to based on your family composition, if you have 1 unit voucher, 2 unit voucher. And based on those vouchers, they will determine what payment standard that you will qualify for. So the PHA determines a payment standard that is the amount generally needed to rent a moderate price dwelling unit in the local housing market that is used to calculate the amount of housing assistance a family will receive. The payment standards does not limit and does not affect the amount of rent the landlord charges or the family may pay. A family which receives a housing voucher can select a unit with a rent that is below above the payment standard. That's correct. The payment standard does not determine the unit the family might rent, but it will determine the unit, how much the family will pay. And there's a certain amount that the housing authority will not allow the family to rent because it's called rent burden. That means the client is paying more of their income towards rent than anything else. So we call it rent burden. And that's why we take a look at that. The housing voucher family must pay 30% of their monthly adjusted income. Excuse me, I think, yeah. The housing voucher family must pay 30% of their monthly adjusted gross income for rent and utilities. And if the unit rent is greater than the payment standard, the family is required to pay the additional amount. That is correct. And usually, there's a certain amount that we will not allow the client to pay. So that's why we try to determine what kind of unit that they have. So most clients that have the voucher numbers, the 2-bedroom vouchers, that's why we stop them from renting a 3-bedroom voucher unit, because the payment on the 3-bedroom will be higher than the payment on a 2-bedroom, and the rent burden will be too high for the family to pay. So we will try to limit the family to rent a payment in a unit that matches with their voucher. And whenever a family moves into a new unit, we will allow them at the first time they move into that unit to pay up to 40% of their adjusted gross income as rent. Roles and responsibilities. Once a PHA approves an eligible family housing unit, the family and the landlord signs a lease. At the same time, the landlord and the PHA signs a housing assistance payment contract that runs for the same time period. There's 3 people here that are partners in this relationship. Is the landlord, the tenant, and the housing authority. The landlord must sign a lease with the client and enforce the lease, because the problem that we have been seeing is that The landlord will sign the lease, but does not enforce the lease. When the landlord only enforces the lease is when the client moves out, and the landlord will start calling the housing authority to help him enforce the lease. That's not the role of the housing authority. Once the landlord signs the lease, like any other private client, you must enforce that lease from the first day the client moves in there. And some things other housing, the other landlords are doing to enforce the lease is, our clients are not sacred cows. Whatever rules apply to your private paying clients applies to our subsidized clients too. But most landlords doesn't, go through that. They think our clients has more protection than any other clients. No, the only protection they have is for us to make sure that that unit meets the HQS standard, housing quality standards, and for the landlord to keep up that unit to meet HQS standard throughout the year, not just that first time, throughout the year the client is living there. So if the client ever calls us and says, the unit is not meeting the HQS standard, we will do another inspection, emergency inspection, and make sure that those units meet those standards. The next one, this means that everyone, tenant, landlord, and PHA has obligations and responsibilities under the voucher program. Yes, they do. And the client's obligation under the program is to make sure that that unit is not destroyed when they move in. So when they move in there, the way the unit was, when they move in there, they have to keep it to that standard. And most housing authorities will make sure that happens. Because if a landlord calls the housing authority has the right to not to give that client a voucher to move to another unit until they have settled up with the landlord. After the landlord have reported that that unit has been destroyed by the client, the housing authority has the right to deny the client a voucher to move to another unit until they have worked out the relationship with the last landlord. When a family selects a housing unit and the PHA approves the unit and lease, the family signs a lease with the landlord for at least 1 year. The program requires that a 1-year lease be signed. After that 1 year, the landlord could sign another lease for another year or leave the lease to go on a month-to-month basis. So I jump down to the last one. So when the family is settled in a new home, the family is expected to comply with the lease, the program requirements, pay each share of their rent on time, and maintain the units in good condition, and notify of any changes in income or family. Just like I said, you have to treat our clients like you treat any other client of yours that is not on the program. They have to pay their rent on time. And you have to collect the rent. You don't call the housing authority after the client is moving and tell the housing authority that you haven't collected the rent for the last 1 or 2 years because they only pay $50, and because they pay $50, you don't care about collecting rent. That's not the role of the housing authority. You must pay. You must collect your rent. You must enforce your lease, like any other client that's living with you. The role of the landlord in the voucher program is to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing to a tenant at a reasonable rate. What that means is that, we have payment standards, and sometimes our payment standards are higher than ongoing rent in that area. So once that is, our rent is not based on the payment standard. It's based on what we call rent reasonableness. What that is whatever you charge a private client renting the same unit. For example, let's say if a 2-bedroom unit at 1,000 square feet, and you charge a private client for 1,000 to rent those units, we expect you to charge our own client the same amount of money. We don't want you to overcharge the client because, the government is paying their subsidy, and then you're going to think you're going to make more money. So the rent has to be reasonable compared to the rent charged in the area that you live in. The dwelling unit must pass the program's housing quality standards and be maintained up to those standards as long as the owner receives housing assistance payment. Like I just said, they must meet HQS standard throughout the year, not just at the first time of inspection. In addition, the landlord is expected to provide services and agrees as part of the lease signed with the tenant and contract signed with the PHA. Roles and responsibilities. The PHA administers the program locally. HUD does not administer the program. PHA and the HUD has an agreement that the PHA will administer the program. So if you have a problem with the program, the first place to call is the PHA. If the PHA cannot resolve the issue, then you could call the HUD field office and we will get involved to make sure that the PHA is dealing with the client fairly and resolve any issue that you have with the PHA. The PHA provides the family with the housing assistance that enables the family to seek out suitable housing. The PHA enters into a contract with the landlord to provide the housing assistance payment on behalf of the family. If the landlord fails to meet the owner's obligation under the lease, the PHA has the right to terminate the assistance payment, because you have an agreement with the PHA, for 1 year. That doesn't mean that they could not terminate the agreement. If they come out and look at you and do an inspection of those units and find out that your units failed HQS inspection, the PHA will give you time to cure those findings. And if you don't cure within the time period, the PHA has the right to terminate the HAP assistance payment agreement. And the PHA must examine the family's income and composition at least annually and must inspect each unit at least annual to ensure that it meets minimum housing quality standards. That rule is there, but we have updated that rule. The PHA is allowed now, with the new streamlined rules, to do annual inspection biannually. So if the PHA has in the administrative plan that to save costs, they were going to do biannual inspection, they're allowed to do that. Do it every other year instead of every year. But it's left to the PHA to adopt that policy and have their board approve it. Roles and responsibility. HUD. To cover the cost of the program, HUD provides funding to allow PHAs to make housing assistance payments on behalf of the family. HUD also pays the PHA fee for the cost of administering the program. Earlier this morning, somebody asked a question that administrative fees, is that going to be over? So HUD pays the PHA and a percentage of the administrative fees. This year, the administrative fees that we pay, that means every voucher that you rent out, every voucher that you give out and is occupied unit, HUD will pay you a certain dollar amount, up to 79% of that dollar amount. So HUD comes out with a figure. For example, let's say IHA's figure is $56 per voucher. And due to the budget constraints, HUD will pay you only 79% of that $56 you're supposed to earn. And that's how the housing authorities earn the money to maintain the program. Every housing authority has what we call a baseline of vouchers. And that baseline is, the total number of vouchers that you cannot go over leasing. But that's not how HUD, calculates your vouchers anymore. Your vouchers now are based on your annual budget authority, which is annually how much HUD has given you to run the program. Because what happens with this program is either you use it or you lose it. Okay, so what you use this year is going to be based on your funding for next year. So let's take Indianapolis, for example. Let's say Indianapolis has 10,000 vouchers, and they're using 8,300 vouchers. At the ending of December, they use only 8,300 vouchers. Their funding for next year will be based on 8,300 vouchers, no longer 10,000 vouchers. So when additional funds become available, HUD will do what we call a NOFA and ask housing authorities to apply to get some kind of additional vouchers. And we have different kind of vouchers. You will see as we go further. And then another HUD role is for the field office to monitor the PHS administration of the program to ensure program rules are properly followed. So the HUD Indianapolis field office job is to make sure that the PHAs are following the rules on administering the program, administering the voucher program. So the next slide shows us the total number of vouchers that we have and how much of it that we have used, and what is the per unit cost, and what's the percentage of those vouchers that we have, and what's the outstanding vouchers that we need to use. If you look at it, we have a current unit ACC. The total vouchers that we have in Indiana is 42,244, and we have used 37,375, and we have 4,869 remaining. And when you look at the percentage, we're using only 88.59% of those vouchers. What does that mean? That means that our per unit cost of administering the program is so high in Indiana that it's taking much of the money than the vouchers. So if you look at our per unit cost, you could see that the per unit cost here is $488.65 per unit in the state of Indiana. Oh, per unit cost is the average amount of the voucher that we pay divided by the total vouchers. So if you take the 144, if you look at below, it says the 144.64 is the total amount that we have spent on the vouchers this year, divided by the total numbers of vouchers that we have. That will give you the per unit cost of each of those vouchers. And the per unit cost has been rising in the state of Indiana. And what causes the per unit cost to rise is based on, one, their payment standard. HUD allows you to go up to 110% of the payment standard. That means every year, around October 1st, our economists, we have an economist that is stationed in region number 5, and region number 5 is made up of Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. And the economists will come up with, rent for each county. So when they come up with those rent thing, HUD allows you to go up to 110%. So what happens is that the housing authorities I can't hear you. Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. So what happens is that the housing authorities will give out vouchers, and the success rate is so low that they come back and say, we cannot find housing. We cannot find housing based on the payment standards. Your payment standards are so low. So they'll tell the client, for example, they'll set their payment standard, one bedroom will be $500. 2 bedroom in Indianapolis, I'm just giving an example, will be $600, and 3 bedroom will be $700. So when the client takes the voucher and go out in Indianapolis, they find out that they cannot find anywhere to rent a 2 bedroom for $600. So they could come back to the housing authority and say to the housing authority, look, you give me 60 days to get a unit. I've gone all over the place. There's no unit. Nobody will rent me 2 bedroom unit for $600. Indianapolis could determine and says, wait a minute, probably we did not set our payment standard to the correct amount. We're going to go higher so that our people could get housing. They could move that payment standard up to 110% of the standard the HUD has published. Or they could bring it, HUD allows you to go 90% to 110%. And if you think it's too high, you could bring it down, but you cannot bring it below 90%, and you could not bring it over 110%. If anything goes over 110%, you have to get approval from the HUD field office. Unless if they're disabled, then you're allowed to go up to 120%. So looking at this, you could see that we still have 4,869 vouchers, but we have spent 98.07% of our money. So we almost spent up the money, but we have still vouchers to give out because our per unit cost is so high that we need to take a look at it and see what is causing the per unit cost. Another thing that could cause the per unit cost to go higher is when you have family compositions, and that family compositions, you give them a 2-bedroom voucher, they're allowed to go rent higher voucher, higher units, and they go in and rent higher units, okay? When they rent the higher units, it gives them a rent burden, but before your utility allowance, remember we give them utility allowance to pay for the utilities in that unit. Your utility allowance will be based not on your voucher, on your 2-bedroom voucher, it will be based on the 3-bedroom voucher. But HUD has changed those rules. Now it has to tie to what voucher that you have. If you have a 2-bedroom voucher, even if you go live in a 10-bedroom voucher, your utility allowance that we gave you will be based on those 2-bedroom vouchers. Okay. And another thing that could cause the per unit cost is the housing authority gives out vouchers based on family compositions. To cut cost, you could have 2 family members stay in 1 bedroom. For example, there's housing authority that say if you have 2 boys, they have to share a room. If you have a boy and the girl a certain age, they could share a room. So some housing authorities will just give out vouchers based on the sex of the family composition. For example, if they have, a single family, they have a boy and a girl, they'll give them 3 vouchers. The parents 1 room, the girl 1 room, the boy 1 room. But they have some housing authorities who try to cut the cost of these per unit vouchers by making the boy and the girl share a bedroom if they're a certain age, and that will cut down the cost of the per unit cost, and then save money for the housing authority to be able to lease up more units to meet to their baseline. So this slide shows the current leasing and vouchers ported into the jurisdiction. What the vouchers ported into the jurisdiction is, with the voucher program, you're allowed to port anywhere in the country. You can use the voucher anywhere you want to in the country. You could decide that you don't want to live in Indianapolis, you want to live in Miami. You could take your voucher to Miami, and the housing authority there will administer your vouchers. So that thing is telling us how many of those that were ported into the jurisdiction from somewhere else. And then the attrition rate is the rate attrition for the whole state of Indiana. That means how many people that have left the program. So the average is running 12.9%. So you're looking at 12.9% every month from average on every housing authority for the people to leave the program. They can leave the program by termination by the housing authority or their income. They have got a job and have an above income where they no longer qualify for the program. If you do not qualify for the program, after you're on the program, you have 6 months to come back to the program. We will leave your name on the program. After that 6 months, if your income is still high enough that you don't come back to the program, then we'll take you off from the program. And then the vouchers that were ported out, the average vouchers that are ported out of our jurisdiction is 472. I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll get to the last slide, then I ask questions. Okay. So if you look at this slide here, it's showing. Look at the graph. You see how our per unit cost just jumped in 2016 and 2019. It just went straight up. So that shows you how the average per unit costs have totally changed. How fast it went up so high. And then if the graph also shows you the top 10 PHS with highest increases in per unit cost over the last year. On the far left end, Those are the PHAs that their per unit cost went so high. And then at the bottom, it shows you the 10 PHAs with the largest reduction in per unit cost over last year. And when you take a look at that, what it tells you is those with the highest per unit cost are one of those where we have problem in leasing up the vouchers. So the housing authorities are doing everything, to make the vouchers work in their jurisdiction to the landlords that are there. So this symposium will help us, recruit more landlords that come on the program, and that will reduce the per unit cost too, because when you have more people on the program, our clients won't have hardship in finding units to lease up. And then on the right side of it tells you the average yearly per unit cost since 2014 to 2019, which is what the graph is showing you. Okay, so this one here shows you a different usage of our vouchers. We have different kind of Section 8 vouchers. We have the mainstream vouchers, and then we have the non-elderly disabled vouchers, and we have the VASH vouchers, and we have the Family Unification Program vouchers, and here it shows you, the housing authorities that have them, and how many they have used, and how many is left to use. And then we have an offer that just closed for the Family Youth Initiative. No, it's not Family Youth. Foster Youth Initiative voucher that just closed on the NOFA that we require the housing authority. So those ones will be coming on board very soon. So these are the usage of our other different types of vouchers, but they all work the same way. They are vouchers, different vouchers that are assigned to different people, but they work the same way. The rules are all applies to all these vouchers the same. So these are a hot list of PHS leasing potential and budget utilization. It just shows us, which ones are the PHS that we need to target, for leasing. Any questions?
What stopgap do we have in place that's everybody on the program can go to Miami?
Nothing.
Nothing, okay.
Yes, sir.
Number two, I've heard, this might happen to one of my tenants in Lafayette, where they had HUD in Chicago, moved to Lafayette, applied for HUD there, and had a place in Chicago and Lafayette where HUD was playing for two places. It may not have been the HUD program. I'm just asking, have you heard of that happening, and how do we prevent that?
Yes, I've heard of that happening. How the housing authorities prevent that is by putting a preference in the administrative plan, and one of those preferences could could use that way to, not stop it, but eliminate how quickly they come on the voucher program and how quickly they get to the top of the waiting list.
Hello. I just wanted to say I appreciate you saying our tenants are not sacred cows.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, I'm a small business and I take a lot of L's to have these tenants. Initially, the prices, I know the market rate. Sometimes it's $800 for a house, but I have to take a lower amount. So, as a landlord, I know my value. The two things I want to mention is I understand, I appreciate the process because it protects me from myself. I have a number of properties. It's hard to get to a lot of the properties, and a lot of times tenants don't talk about the problems that are going on in a house, like a gutter falling, and it might take me 7 months to get there, but the annual inspections helped out a lot. The one thing that I would like to ask is how can we improve the communication between the landlords and the PHVs?
The PHA, a good PHA should have a landlord symposium every month, a landlord outreach every month. That allows the landlord to come in there and have one-on-one with the PHAs to identify the issues that they're having with their property, and the PHA should be able to address those. Talking about not going to their unit for over 7 months, I happen to have sold my home 2 months ago and moved into an apartment. This is my 2nd month in the apartment. I got a knock. I wasn't at home. My daughters got a knock on the door. They refused to open the door. It was the landlord coming to inspect the unit, to do a walk around in the unit to make sure that the unit is still the same way they listed to us. This is 2nd month that we have lived there. So what I'm saying to say is that it's the landlord's responsibility to make sure that the unit is kept up. It's not the HUD's responsibility and it's not the PH's responsibility. It's the landlord to make sure that you know who's living in your unit and they are keeping your unit to your standard. We don't want you to call us after they have destroyed the unit and you want us to take action. But if that happens, the PHA should be able to make sure that it's not wear and tear. It's something that has been destroyed. They could stop the client from moving on to the settle up with the landlord. Okay.
Landlord, oh, there we go. So there's a whole presentation this afternoon on how PHAs can work with landlords and be better partners with landlords, and a big piece of that presentation is on communication. And also part of that presentation is next year we're going to be launching a strategy guide that's going to give PHAs kind of a roadmap for how to improve those communications based on the size of their PHA and their needs and their jurisdiction. So definitely more on that later and more on that in the coming year. Okay, one more question.
Hi, as a management agent landlord, I know that you had stated that the housing choice voucher holders can choose a unit of their choosing. If, let's say, a 2-bedroom unit the PHA has deemed is $600, but the apartment community has determined that rent for that unit is $625. Is the voucher holder permitted to pay that extra $25 difference, or does the apartment community need to lower their rent to $600?
They can pay up to $620 if there's the initial move-in, but they cannot go over 40% of the adjusted gross income.
Okay.
That amount cannot be more than 40% of the adjusted gross income on the initial move-in.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to take this time to introduce our next speaker. Joe Harris is an attorney in Crown Point, and I've known Joe since, I would say 20 years ago, when he was in Andrea High School, and then graduated from Valparaiso High School, and then passed his bar and become a lawyer. And Joel has become a backbone to a lot of housing authorities in the Northwest Indiana area. He is the attorney for East Chicago Housing Authority and the attorney for Gary Housing Authority. In East Chicago Housing Authority, I had to work very closely with Joel when we had the Superfund site problem in East Chicago. I don't know if you guys know about the West Calumet Superfund site. Where they found out that there were lead poisoning the public housing residents in the West Calumet, and we had to move everybody within 6 months out of there and declare it unsafe for somebody to live in. And I tell you, every person came out from the woodwork trying to find a way to sue HUD, and Joe helped us navigate all that. And he's been working with the housing authorities for so long and knows the HUD rules back and forth. So he's a very good person to introduce to our next topic here. Please help me in welcoming Joe to the podium. Joe.
Good morning, everyone. I basically want to piggyback on some of Bruce's comments. Thank you. Yeah, Bruce is a little taller. I basically want to piggyback on some of Bruce's comments. Bruce did a great job of covering the HCV program requirements, and my focus is a little more on compliance with Indiana law with respect to landlord and tenants and that relationship. Of course, the HCV program requirements are a large part of what you came here to learn about and what's important, but in addition to that, we also have to make sure that we're complying with Indiana law in the process as well. So when you look at the whole scope of what's happening here in the context of the HCV program, the PHA has approved a voucher. A unit has passed inspection, there's a HAP agreement that's in place, and you would think, okay, now we're ready to roll, we're ready to go. I'm a landlord, I'm gonna be a tenant, and before you get there, I can't stress enough the importance of the lease agreement itself. And it's not necessarily on a slide, but as I was listening to the prior presentations, I thought it was important to stress how important that lease agreement is. It serves as the foundation of that relationship going forward. And in addition to the program requirements themselves, the lease agreement will also spell out what the expectations are of the tenant and the expectations of the landlord, and then also what the PHA finds acceptable because they issued the voucher. I would always recommend from the PHA's perspective and the landlord's perspective to make sure that you have a model lease agreement in place, especially if you're a landlord that has multiple properties. It makes the communication between the landlord and the PHA that much better, that they're on the same page and understand what's happening. But in addition to that, when and if you have any disputes and you have to litigate this in court, the attorney who's handling that for you is well versed with the terms of that agreement. So I think that's something that is very important. You can please keep in mind that that model lease agreement can be updated over time. You know, as you experience more or learn certain circumstances exist, as time goes on, modify that model lease agreement and get it to suit your needs or some of the concerns in your location locally. I'll give you a good example of that. In Gary, for example, there is a unique situation where utility bills can only be in a tenant's name. They can never be in the property owner's name. The reason for that, and I don't want to get too far off onto a tangent, but the reason for that is because the sewer utility gets all of its data from the water company. The Indiana American Water Company puts all the accounts in the tenant's name. So for that purpose, all the sewer bills are in the tenant's name, and that's something that's unique to a particular location that you probably want to address in that lease agreement. You may go into that relationship thinking, hey, I'm going to make sure the lease reads this way, but you need to make sure it suits the particulars in the location that you're in. And I just use that as an example of why you need to make sure you pay particular attention to the terms of the lease agreement. All right. Just to provide you with a brief overview of landlord-tenant law in Indiana, the reason for these laws, the reason they exist, is to govern the relationship between a landlord and a tenant in a residential setting. These laws usually regulate several issues concerning rental property, including the obligations of a tenant and also those of a landlord, the issuing of notices, and matters concerning security deposits, among other things. Security deposits are in place in order to protect the landlord from several things. Security deposit is intended to replace any damages that a tenant may have caused. Unfortunately, that happens all too often, and even the security deposit that is in place oftentimes isn't sufficient to cover those damages. And unfortunately, I see many of you nodding your heads that that's an unfortunate circumstance. The security deposit that's required must be reasonable. Most lease agreements call for first month, last month, and that's basically what has been determined to be reasonable. I think it is important that when drafting the lease agreement that you have counsel that drafts that's familiar with what judges in your jurisdiction find to be reasonable. In some areas, there's particular concerns about tenants being somewhat reckless with units, and a little bit higher security deposit may be appropriate. But in addition to that, you need to make sure you're complying with the HCV program requirements and what the PHA finds acceptable. But in addition to that, the security deposit, there can be deductions made from that for unpaid rent, for damages, and for unpaid utility charges. They're specifically outlined in Indiana Code 32-31-3-12, and it spells it out in a little bit more detail, but the nuts and bolts of it is the security deposit can be used to cover those three things: unpaid rent, damages, and unpaid utility charges. All right, the tenant's obligations. The obligations of a tenant are outlined under Indiana Code 32-31-7-5, and those obligations are basically four basic ones. To keep the rental unit in proper and clean condition, to comply with the stipulated housing and health codes in your location, comply with the lease agreement, which again is of the utmost importance, and refrain from damaging the property in any way. That's the basis of the tenant's obligation. Oftentimes, a tenant will be new to renting property or any type of agreement like that, and think as long as I pay my rent, that's all I have to do. I don't have any other obligations. If something breaks, it's the landlord's responsibility. And it's a little more complicated than that. The circumstances do matter, and it's important that the tenant be careful with the property. They don't own it. They do have what's called a leasehold interest in the property, but they don't have an ownership interest in it. And it's important that both the landlord and the tenant respect the rights that each other have and make sure that the unit is always kept in a proper operating condition. All right, the landlord's obligations. Let's see. There it is. The obligations of a landlord are outlined under Indiana Code 32-31-8-5. The landlord has an obligation to deliver a safe premises. Obviously, if it passes the inspection, in order to become eligible, you would assume everything should be fine. That duty, though, exists beyond that initial inspection. It needs to remain in good condition, and that's the job of a HCV program administrator, coordinator, or whatever the title is to make sure these landlords are continuing to keep these units in proper condition. In addition to making sure they're safe, they need to make sure that the joint areas of the residential property are in proper and clean conditions. So in addition to the unit itself, you want to make sure that the environment around that unit is clean, grass is cut. The idea is that the housing that's being approved by the Public Housing Authority is something that you would want to stay in. You want to make sure that it's something that's appropriate for families and it's safe. All right, and again, that's a sign of the landlord showing respect to the tenant. And lastly, the landlord must comply with just like the tenant, must comply with all of the housing and health codes in your location. That, again, is of the utmost importance. Going to termination of the rental agreement. A rental agreement terminates pursuant to the terms of the agreement. However, a landlord is authorized to quit a rental agreement without notice under certain conditions. The first one is when a tenant knowingly commits waste, and that's that they're abusive to the property. It's clear that they have no respect for it. I've seen situations where there are several dogs that are kept in the home and the walls and doors are completely scratched up, or they don't have the heat on properly, causing all the pipes to burst in the wintertime. Some of those things that are clearly waste, not just a mistake, but something that's intentional, and repetitive instances of waste are also an indication of a serious problem. I always keep in mind what would a judge want to hear when I go to complain about something that's happening in a unit, and generally repetition and the degree of waste is really what will convince a judge. In addition to committing waste, when a tenant continues to occupy a rental unit after a lease has expired, that's referred to as a holdover tenant. Generally, those tenants are on a month-to-month basis at that point, but it would still require, one, for the landlord to be open to that month-to-month tenancy, and two, for them to comply with all the other terms of the conditions of the lease agreement, which has since expired. I would caution you to not have holdover tenants, not allow the leases to expire, and to make sure you get those renewed prior to the expiration of the lease, just so you don't fall into this situation. It's messy and it just causes problems for everyone. Again, if a tenant does not pay rent, obviously that is a clear issue. And the last one is somewhat vague, but it's a provision that's in the law, and that's when the landlord-tenant relationship doesn't exist anymore. What's intended by that is when there's a complete breakdown in communication, that tenant is just ghost. You don't know where they are, you don't know what they're doing, but that communication just isn't there anymore. It's clear they're not occupying the unit anymore. Outstanding utility bill is left there, but the family that you once saw there isn't there anymore. It's basically an abandonment of the property. Okay. All right, the next slide is access to rental property. A landlord may not interfere with a tenant's access to a dwelling unless the property has been abandoned, similar to what I referred to earlier. And interference is specifically outlined under Indiana law as changing the locks. These are things that you cannot do prematurely. You can't interfere with them until you know clearly that they've abandoned the property. But you can't change the locks, you can't remove doors, remove appliances that would make the unit uninhabitable, or interrupting utilities, calling up the public utility, or water or sewer, and disconnecting them, cutting them off. You want to make sure the property is clearly abandoned or the lease agreement is terminated pursuant to its terms. Otherwise, you'll have legal problems that you've interfered with their leasehold interest in the property, their ability to quietly enjoy that space that they've entered into a lease agreement to do. A tenant may not unreasonably deny the landlord access to the dwelling for certain specific purposes. The first would be for routine inspections, bed bugs, etc., safety inspections, to make necessary or agreed repairs, to provide certain services, and for the exhibition of the unit to a prospective tenant or for sale, if those are the circumstances. Now, this is going to get us into an issue that I think is a little more interesting than just the basic landlord-tenant laws, but access to the unit is something that can cause landlords some serious problems. And the reason for that is because there are certain privacy rights, expectations of privacy that tenants have. And you want to make sure that as a landlord, you are going into the unit for a particular purpose as outlined under the law and pursuant to the terms of the lease agreement. And also to make sure that you comply with the PHA's requirements. You don't want to be ineligible for the HCV program. You need to make sure that you're complying with it. A landlord is required to provide reasonable notice to the tenant upon entry to the unit. The landlord should only enter at reasonable times and for what's necessary. There is, let me go back. There is what is the Fourth Amendment, and I think that is related to the whole issue of access to the rental unit. The Fourth Amendment provides for freedom from unreasonable searches or seizures, and there's a citation there that kind of outlines where that is. There's a scenario that I wanted to discuss with you, and it's involving an administrative warrant. So in addition to the routine inspections that whether it be a PHA itself or a landlord, if we're talking about the HCV program, does, there are instances where there are disputes as to whether or not notice is reasonable and whether or not the inspection is actually necessary. We had a situation with one of the housing authorities that I represent that there was a tenant that complained that there was unreasonable notice provided, that there wasn't an actual need to enter the unit for the purpose that was provided, and this ended up getting filed in court. And ultimately, the court decided that because of the circumstances surrounding the entry to the unit, that the court wanted to implement a new procedure that would be a prerequisite to entering into the unit prior to conducting any routine inspections, maintenance, et cetera. And what that particular judge required was that the PHA, it could apply to a landlord though as well in the HCV program, obtain an administrative warrant. And I don't know, is there anyone that knows what an administrative warrant is or has to go through that process? I hadn't heard of it either. It was something that came up actually in the course of litigation. And basically what an administrative warrant is it's a requirement that you file a petition with the court routinely and prior to conducting the inspection. And that petition for an administrative warrant outlines when your inspection will take place and what exactly is being inspected and pursuant to what schedule. And I know it sounds odd to probably many of you, and that was the case with us as well, but when courts, who are courts of equity, find that there is the potential for a violation of the Fourth Amendment rights of a tenant, they have the ability, in order to ensure that those rights aren't violated, to create this hurdle. And it can be an inconvenience, and I know some of my clients here are familiar with that. It can be an inconvenience, but it does also afford a certain level of protection for, in this instance, the PHA, that everything is in writing, it was approved by a judge, and we're going in with a court order. That does seem overboard. I don't believe that should be required, but in some instances that happens, and it's all for the purpose of protecting the tenant's Fourth Amendment rights. So kind of backing that discussion up, I think what is important on the front end is that you provide the notice that's required, that it be reasonable, that you're going in for a particular purpose, so that you don't have to deal with the potential headache of having to routinely obtain administrative warrants prior to entering into these units. Again, it's really the nature of the landlord-tenant relationship is understanding and respecting each other's rights, clearly outlining what your duties and responsibilities are in the lease agreement, and making sure that the housing that is being provided and being occupied is safe and habitable. So I know that I don't have much information on that administrative warrant piece, but I did want to allow some time for any questions that's related to that or anything else that we covered here today.
Hi, I just have a quick question regarding that. Is that just, hopefully I would never need it, but in the case that you do, is that just filed in a small claims or?
So it doesn't have to be filed in small claims, but it can, because there's not any monetary relief there. So typically the jurisdiction of the small claims court is limited based upon the dollar amount in controversy. With this not being an issue of money, then yes, a small claim can have jurisdiction over that, but it can be any court on its plenary docket could hear this as well. In this instance, how it came up, there was injunctive relief sought to stop any future inspections until such time that that hearing was held. And that was the conclusion of that hearing was, hey, let's avoid this problem going forward. We won't necessarily determine whether or not there was a violation of any rights or not, but in order to make sure that this doesn't happen going forward, come to the court, get an administrative warrant, and you'll be able to inspect the unit with approval of the court. And then there's no dispute between the landlord and the tenant.
Access to the property, give reasonable notice. What is considered reasonable?
Good question. Just what a reasonable person would do. So that is part of the importance of when you are developing what your standards are, when you're developing the terms of your lease agreement, you really want to make sure you have people involved in that process, not just the lawyer, but in addition to the lawyer, but also individuals who are familiar with the real estate market in your area, to chime in on that and provide you with some advice, because if there's a dispute about it, what matters isn't necessarily what I find reasonable or what you find reasonable. It's going to be what the judge finds to be reasonable. So it only becomes an issue when it's a problem. And the only person that's making the determination as to whether or not the notice you provided was reasonable is a judge. Now, if the parties agree what reasonable notice is and include it in the lease agreement, then it's not vague anymore. You know exactly what is reasonable because you've agreed to it. So I can't give you a straight answer to that, but that's how you go through the process of determining what's reasonable. The statutes use the term reasonable and don't define it necessarily. But again, you can determine the rules of the game by including those terms and provisions in your lease agreement. And if you don't, for some reason, have that provision in the lease agreement, then you want to make sure you have a lawyer who's familiar with the tendencies of the particular judge and would know this is what he or she would go for or what he or she wouldn't go for.
Under the housing quality standards, or under the Housing Choice Voucher Program, it states that if one of our tenants does not attend 2 appointments or 2 inspections, that they relinquish their voucher then. So why would we have to go to court to get a warrant?
So that process was in the context of a PHA, not with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. But if that is a provision with the program that's not complied with, then it's something that probably won't be an issue in that particular context. So the situation I described was a public housing situation, not housing choice. But you're right, if that were to happen, you shouldn't have that issue. That's not a very common issue at all, and no one raised their hands of having heard of it, but I just thought it was interesting to discuss.
All right, so we have one last question over here, and then we'll be moving forward. Thank you.
This might be too specific. This is regarding landlord entry. What would you suggest in situations where you provide reasonable notice to the tenant for an inspection because you have concerns, unauthorized people living there that aren't on the lease, perhaps pets? When you conduct the inspection, those unauthorized people aren't there, or the pets aren't there, and so there's really no way to document these concerns that you have because you provided the notice and they've had the time to take care of that.
So if that notice is pursuant to the terms of the lease agreement, and let's say, for example, you have to post notice, you can show up and provide them with written notice. If they're not there, you can post it and leave it at the unit, right? And if you don't hear back from them, which you don't necessarily have to, their consent is implied because it was pursuant to the terms and conditions of the lease that they agreed to. So I would recommend that you go forward so long as you provided that proper notice. I don't see you having an issue in that scenario at all. Sometimes there are landlords that think I didn't get confirmation back from them that it was okay, and you don't need actual consent. That consent is implied because they agreed to the notice. So if you gave them 48 hours notice, you posted it at the unit, you're following the rules that everyone agreed to, and there's no problem with the inspection. I think the bigger issue is when there's an emergency and you want to get into the unit, you don't provide them notice as outlined in the lease agreement. That is a stickier situation because then you have to make sure that if you're challenged, the circumstances rises to the level of an actual emergency. Now that's a lot touchier. All done? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Very interesting presentation. I just want to say we're trying to keep everything on track and on time. My name is Nick Bilka from the Housing Choice Voucher Program. I'm a policy advisor. I just wanted to let you know, I know we've let some of the question sessions go a little short. At least as far as questions about the voucher program go, I will be around here all day. I'll be giving another presentation this afternoon, so hopefully you'll have an opportunity to ask questions then as well. For the table discussion, we have a couple questions to tee up in relation to your practices, and this kind of goes off what the last presentation was. With relation to tenant or participant screening, what are you seeing? What are your best practices for tenant screening? How have your screening processes changed over time? And then dealing with difficult tenants. PHAs, do you provide mediation services to help tenants and landlords resolve disputes? And landlords, what is your experience when you've had issues with HCV tenants? How have you consulted, and what have you done differently than you do with your market rate tenants? So this is something for you all to discuss at your tables, and then we'll have a break. And Leah, I think, is going to lead you in a brief stretch while you can start to discuss these things right now.
Push the button, you see the red light comes on, and then when you get done talking. Again, these are also
Or,
just push it once when you let's talk, and we'll line up for you.
and then,
When you're done.
Yeah, 3 people in this one. You're gonna let me know when you're ready to broadcast, right? Okay. Okay. Do you want some water? Let me just go in the kitchen. Our total time is till, conversation. Okay. No, but I hope. Oh, don't worry.
want to sit in between? If I could ask everyone to, excuse me, if I could ask everyone to have their seats. We're going to go ahead and get started here pretty soon. The broadcasting will start. Okay, tell me when. Okay. You ready? Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12 o'clock. Okay. This is the fun part of the symposium. So in order to have a landlord symposium, you have to have both landlords and tenants. So today we're going to have the perspective of both of those persons. My name is Valerie Calhoun, and I work for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as a portfolio manager, and I am going to be your moderator today for our landlords and our tenants, and I'll briefly introduce them. We have Harvey Levine. Harvey has been involved in affordable housing in his community for over 40 years as an investor of property management and real estate advisor here in the Indianapolis area. In 1985, he started doing and accepting housing choice vouchers, and in 2011, he was approached in developing a property management company for the purpose of doing single-family homes and actually renting to housing choice voucher recipients. Harvey has lots of honors and everything that he has in his portfolio. We have next Bridget Thornton. Bridget was born in Indianapolis and has 3 amazing children. She is a business owner of Diva in Red Incorporated here in Indianapolis. What she does is teaches ladies between the ages of 10 to 18 about business, entrepreneurship, literacy, anything that is dealing with life skills so that you could actually become successful. Bridget is an author. Bridget is published, y'all, okay? And what I want to tell you, one thing that she has in her portfolio, and I want everybody to take this to heart. She says in one of her books, become so financially free that you forget it's payday. Think about that, okay? Think about that, okay? All right, for our last person, we have Miss Alicia Young. Alicia is also from Indianapolis, and she has been on the Housing Choice Voucher Program for 5.5 years. But the most amazing thing about Miss Young, the most amazing thing, is in October of 2019, she purchased a house. Raise your hands. You can actually see at that point how the Housing Choice Voucher Program works right here, and we're going to actually talk about that. She says that it was the most amazing thing. It was a roller coaster of an emotion, but guess what? She's here and she's ready to go. Okay? So welcome all 3 of my panelists. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have some fun today, okay? So my first question is going to be for Harvey. Harvey, why did you participate or decide to participate in this program?
Well, as you mentioned, in 1985 I started, and I will admit that when I bought my first property in 1980, my management techniques were that of a slumlord. And I was fortunate enough that my house caught on fire, and with the insurance money, we did a fantastic remodel. It was a double. Matter of fact, I still own it today, and it's on the program today. the tenants who came to apply were part of the voucher program. And I looked into it, and it sounded like a great opportunity. So we brought the tenants on. At that time, that was my only home that the rent would have been low enough for Section 8. I had other higher rental properties. But what I found was my tenants were fantastic. They both remained in the property for 5+ years. And I started thinking that I should start buying more properties that would be in the price point for the voucher program. So for me, it was just an excellent investment opportunity.
Okay.
That's it.
Right. This is for Bridget. Bridget, how did you find out about the Housing Choice Voucher Program?
I found out about the program almost 20 years ago. When I applied for Section 8, my daughter, who is now 20, was only 3 months old. And I sat on the waiting list for about 15 years. Yeah, but when my lottery number came up, it was just like that, like hitting the lottery, like, wow. You know, you waited for something for so long, but now here it is. At the time, I had just had surgery. I was off work, and I was facing an eviction because I could not pay my rent because my FMLA fell through. That was in Houston, Texas. So when I got the call stating that, hey, you got some mail, because I still have my grandmother's address, I got the letter saying that I've been chosen. I said, okay, that's my cue. Packed up the U-Haul, and me and all three moved back here to Indianapolis, and it's been history in the making.
Okay, Elisa, describe your experience in searching for housing with your voucher. Now, I'm going to assume, I'll ask, and then maybe you can just say, did you rent first before you purchased the home that you're currently in, or were you renting something else first and then purchased something completely new?
Well, actually, I was already renting an apartment. And the apartment that I stayed in didn't take Section 8 when I received my voucher. So the sister apartment did. So I had to stay in that apartment for 6 months, which my 6 months was almost up. And I just transferred my lease over. And that's where I have been ever since.
Okay. And so when you describe your experience in searching, can you give me a little bit more on how you actually found something or found the house that you were in right now? How did that process work for you?
That was a long process. It actually took me 3 years because I had a little minor setback on the late car note. So it threw me out of the program, well, not, like out of the INHP program for a minute. So I had to get my credit back up to where it needed to be so I can continue to search for my house. But yes, it was a headache. I searched high and low, day and night. I didn't get any sleep. I was constantly on the internet because the houses are going super fast. Like, they could be on there now, and in 10 minutes, they're off the market. So yes, it was a major headache. But when I finally found this house, I just knew it was mine. And I kept saying that, this is my house. I'm going to move in this house. This is the house for me and my kids. And that's what happened.
Bridget, what has been your experience working with landlords and having a voucher?
My experience has always been extremely positive because I came into the program with a positive outlook. I knew that I would not be on this program for long. I looked at it as a stepping stone, if you will. And so I've had open communication with landlords. I told them I'm not going to be in your property long. I'm only here long enough till I get ready to purchase my house. And I meant that. And they were like, well, I don't know if I want you here because I need somebody that's going to be here, which is what most landlords want. But they all gave me a chance. I've only had 3 units the 5 years that I've been here. And I'm in the process now. After being told no by INHP so many times, I'm actually in the process of purchasing my home cash through completing the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher and the FSS program. I took the money that I got from accomplishing goals that I already had set anyway, and use that to purchase my house cash. And then I'm fortunate enough to have a brother who does rehab, so he's able to take my property and flip it for me. I'm gonna live on one side and rent out the other side, hopefully on the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. And then I'm gonna do it debt-free. So I won't have to worry about a mortgage, I won't have to worry about rent, and then I'll still stick with my motto with becoming so financially free that you won't know it's payday.
Okay. Harvey, based on your experience, how do market rate tenants and HCV tenants differ?
Well, as people, I think they're all the same. I get asked this question a lot, usually from people who've never been involved with the HCV program because of a lot of misconceptions about people who are on that program. And what I try to explain to people is that market rate tenants in a low-income area, which is where most of the HCV housing is, are the same people who are in the HCV program. The HCV program are just people who were lucky enough to have the lottery draw or get put onto the program. We have found, though, that when the units are returned to us after a tenant moves out, the market rate or the market tenant units are usually not in as good of condition as the Section 8 tenants. And I think that's because as a landlord and as a property manager, we want to maintain our properties, but there's kind of a, if it's not a problem for the tenant, then maybe we don't need to do that today. And things get pushed to the wayside. With the Section 8 HCV program, we have to maintain those units, and we have to do that on at least an annual basis. So from that perspective, I don't know if it's that the tenants take better care because they also are being inspected, or if it's because we take better care. But for the most part, we're a little bit different than a lot of other property management companies because our preference is for HCV participants over market rate tenants.
Now, this question is for both of the ladies, and you all can ask it or answer it any way that you need to. But what has been your experience with working with the Housing Authority or PHAs? And I'm assuming that you've only worked with one in one housing authority, or if you have worked in a different housing authority, then please explain the differences or how your experience was with both.
I've only worked with one housing authority, and my experience, it was okay. It was kind of confusing at first because I didn't know what to do, but that's anyone that don't, never been on a program before. So, but when I got with my one case manager, and I've had her up until it was time for me to purchase my house, so it was just that one person I had to deal with, and it's kind of hard to kind of contact them, but other than that, that's about it.
For me, my experience has been phenomenal. I'm a people person. I believe in communication. I show up, I send emails, I make the phone calls, I leave the voicemails, and then I follow up. So they pretty much know me down on Meridian Street. But I enjoyed every single bit of it. In my program, I deal with a lot of kids who are raised in the Section 8 housing program or in low-income housing, so I'm able to have a first-hand knowledge as to what some of them are going through, and so it makes my experience a lot less traumatic, I guess, because I'm able to get both sides of the playing field, so to speak. But it's been phenomenal. I've learned an awful lot, stuff that you had no clue. I mean, everything from the inspection process, because I'm that person, when you come in my house, I need to walk with you. I need to see where you're going, what you're looking at. You know, is this something that I need to fix? Is this something my landlord needs to fix? If it's something that he can't fix, can I fix this on my own prior to, you know, the next inspection? Because I don't have time to wait for you to tell me, you know, you can't live here because this is broke, if it's something that I can fix within my power. So it's been a phenomenal experience.
Harvey, describe your relationship with the PHAs and what services do they offer that you appreciate? And also, do they offer anything that you think that is unnecessary or that could be necessary?
That's a really good question. Relationships have to be a give and take situation. There are a lot of different aspects to the PHA. Different departments do different things. Within those departments, you have many different people. Some people are great at their jobs, some people are not great at their jobs. What I've learned from all the time that I've been involved with PHAs is that, again, like she said, it boils down to communication. When you have positive communication, things get resolved quickly. And the goal of a landlord or property manager and the PHA should be a partnership. Both of us should have the common goal of providing quality housing for the tenant. The services that they offer, I think, are pretty normal administrative type services. Some of the services that I think would be a big benefit would be a little bit more openness towards landlords' perspectives prior to developing policies. I think it should be the same thing with the tenants. I'm not aware of whether they do that or not, but having more focus groups with participants either on the tenant or the landlord side would be a big improvement in that. Again, for the most part, I've had positive experiences, otherwise I wouldn't still be doing this after all these years. I think, again, that some of the best things that can happen is more positive interaction and more sharing of issues to create resolutions.
The ladies, I don't know if I even asked you this from the very beginning, but your length of participation, your initial participation on the program, can you tell me exactly when you started and when either, because I know one of you is off of the program right now, and then the other, you still just did your home ownership. Can you give me a little chronological piece as to how you came on the program and how that started for both of you?
Well, for me, like I said, I was on the waiting list. I spent more time on the waiting list than I did in the actual program itself. But that's a good thing. I've been on it for about 5 years, and now I have transitioned off of it, of course, because I'm grading. I'm purchasing my home, and I'm not going through the INHP. And it's not to say there's anything against INHP, but the whole process from beginning to end, it was a good experience for me. I think the only thing that I had an issue with when it came to the FS program, which is the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, is once you transition from the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher to that program, and that's where you get ready to purchase your home, and you set your goals, and then those goals basically help you to get to where you want to be, which is ultimately home ownership. All that was great. It's when you get to only having one other program that can get you through the door, which is the INHP program. So if INHP says, no, your credit score is not too high, then you got to go back to the drawing board. If they say, no, you don't have enough money for your down payment, like they basically have it's like a end all be all with them. And I think we should look at other alternatives as far as purchasing a home. INHP should not be the only first-time home buyers program that we could be referred to, or that the clients could be referred to as far as taking that next step. Because for a person who's not, what's the term I want to use? For somebody who is not as savvy as far as finding loopholes and other ways around it, they can take that no, and that'll just be it. They'll sit on Section 8 for forever and never actually accomplish their goal as far as home ownership. But you're not just going to tell me no, and I'm just going to take that, and that's what it's going to be. So I think if we put other programs in position and say, okay, if INHP doesn't work out, let's try this one, or let's try this one, or also have somebody in place prior to even getting to that point that will say, okay, well, we know your credit score has to be at least a 634. Right now, you're at a 520. Let's work with you to get that credit cleaned up so that before we even send you over there, we can get that part taken care of. I hope I answered your question. I'm long-winded. I'm sorry, y'all.
Okay. And I need you to repeat the question. Sorry.
Well, I initially said that I really didn't ask you, I wanted a chronological timeline for you being on the program to where you are now, and just kind of explain how, your experience has been or anything else like that. It really should have been my introductory, but, we're taking care of it now.
Okay. Actually, I was a senior in high school, and I didn't know that you couldn't get on Section 8 without kids. So my best friend, she heard that the Section 8 list had opened up, and she called me, and she's like, hey, give me your information. I'm like, for what? And I gave it to her, and she's like, I'll put you on the Section 8 list, and hopefully you get picked. Well, 10 years later, I got that lottery number in the mail, but it was worth it because that's when I actually had my first kid 10 years later down the line. So it all fell in place on how I ended up getting on the program. And like I said, I've only been on there for 5.5 years. My goal was to get on the program to get me a house. That was the ultimate goal. I didn't want to be on the program all my life, just, paying rent here and there. I wanted to own a home. And then when I got the program and had my kids, it was a much more goal. It went to the top of the list, So, but other than that, everything has been, I enjoy it. I enjoyed working with the people I work with, getting on the program. It went kind of fast once I received my voucher, and like I said, I was already in one place, and I just transferred it over, so that didn't take much time at all. And everything kind of been in place since then.
Harvey, how has the program evolved since you first started working with the Housing Choice Voucher Program?
Good or bad?
Good or bad, huh? Well, in the beginning, I think it was a much smaller program, and I'm not exactly sure what year the program started in Indianapolis, but I know that at this time it still was pretty small. And there was less, I think there was less administrative paperwork that we had to go through. We still had to do the RTA system, but everything seemed to flow a little bit easier. Now, for the inspection, I have to say, I'd mentioned before, the first property had just been completely renovated from a fire. I remember the inspector went and did the inspection and looked at me and said, "This is the nicest house I have ever seen on the program." Well, it was basically a brand new house. I think as the program has grown, both locally and nationally, additional things have come up. I know that inspections are always a big negative for most landlords. For me, I'm okay with it because I want the property to be in good condition anyway. I am happy to hear about this new Inspire process and anxious to learn more about that. I think that again, we're going back to what's been said here with communication. I think as the program has gotten bigger and more people are on it, their staffing has had less ability to have direct communication. Just as a for instance, we had walk-in once a week where we could walk in, talk to caseworkers, talk to finance, talk to inspections. That got changed to every other week. While most landlords don't have as many properties as we do, they may be okay with having it every other week. For us, it was a big benefit to have that. So I guess that would be a bad. However, as things grow, you have to have accommodations, and I understand that, and we work within that. So I would say it's just a little bit more cumbersome, and I'm not sure that there's a whole lot anybody can do about that, just because of the size.
And perhaps even HUD regulations.
Perhaps.
Perhaps. And this is again for you, Harvey. Yes. Okay. Okay. Does anyone in the room have questions for my panelist?
Hi, I'm Gail. This is not really a question. This is more of an observation. I used to have several hundred properties on Section 8, and we have scaled back because of communication. And all of my tenants, a lot of them will call constantly. Every week, we'll get 50 calls for tenants wanting properties that I would love to supply them with, and I have the properties to supply them with. But the program became so cumbersome and so difficult that I've chosen not to. I'm here because I love my Section 8 tenants. I want to provide good, healthy housing, but we have to have open lines of communication. We have to have focus groups to help these people. And government processes, they make the policy, but we're boots on the ground. We know the problems. We want to help the people, and we've got a lot of solutions. But never in over 10 years was I ever asked, how can we help you? How can we make it easier? Do you want to be on a focus group? And so, unfortunately, I know, they call, and I don't even have owners that want to accept Section 8 anymore because the process, they said every time I call, I don't get callbacks, I don't get answers. It's so difficult, and I want them to come into it. I want to be part of it, but we need help.
And a major reason why we're here at the symposium, not to cut you off, major reason is so that you can connect with housing authorities.
Because I'm like, not everybody knows both sides of it, right. And I think if we could have groups it's managing houses, I always say, is easy. They don't talk back. You fix them, they stay vacant, they're good. We're in the business of managing behaviors. We manage people, and that's what we need help in doing, is learning how to manage the people and teaching them. Some of these people don't even know how to take care of things. They don't really understand the rules, So that's why I'm here today, is like, get together and everybody share their ideas so that I know housing is huge. I have houses to rent. I would like to get involved back in the program, but I need more groups.
Okay, no problem. We will definitely get you in touch with your local housing authority. Ladies and gentlemen, the panel of the landlords and the tenants, give them a round of applause, please. Okay, I believe the next thing is a lunch break. Is someone coming here? Okay, I believe the next thing is a lunch break. Kimberly is coming up front. Is Kimberly coming up front? Kimberly Wise is coming up front to give us a quick synopsis as to what's next. But thank you all very much for listening to our panel.
So how's everybody doing? So we got through the morning session, and we're looking forward to having all of you guys come back this afternoon. So in your folders, you'll have a list of local restaurants. There is also a local cafe just across the grass. If you guys want to stay local, you can feel free to stay here in this room. We'll have some additional snacks that'll be available for you. But for those of you who won't be staying with us, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for spending your morning with us. We know how busy you guys are. Hopefully we provided the kind of information that you need to help you do your jobs better. If you have any comments for the voucher team, please go ahead and write them down and leave them on the table. But enjoy your lunch. We'll see you guys back here in 1 hour, and we do plan to try to stay as close to on schedule as we can. Thank you.